Roughness. It's problem numero uno for legions of so-called roller coaster enthusiasts, and it's not hard to see why. Nothing can ruin the happy mood of a theme park visit or lead to a hissy fit on the side of the exit platform quite like a slight rattle. We've all experienced the horror, excitement, and eagerly building anticipation up the lift until the first pullout shows its hand and the smile quickly fades. 2 minutes of joy transform into 2 minutes of CTE. But obviously nobody is trying to build roller coasters that beat your brains out, right? So then, what gives? Today I'm here to answer that deceptively complex question. Why are some coasters rough and others are smooth? There are classic coasters dating from the previous millennium that coddle you through their hand-bent curves. Then there are multi-million-dollar modern marvels made from cutting-edge technology that toss you around like loose change in a washing machine. Old woodies that track smooth as glass, and brand new brand new attractions that are thoroughly embarrassed by coasters 30 years their elder. No rhyme or reason. What is going on here? I wish there were such a thing as a simple answer. As you can probably guess, the truth is a bit complicated. But believe me, I think it's worth investigating. And with a little bit of a deep dive, we can hopefully start to answer some of the more substantial overarching questions. Why are some coasters super smooth while others beat the crap out of you? Why are woodies rougher than steel coasters, and why do they get rougher as time passes? Are old arrows really rough, or are they something completely different entirely? All that and more on our latest roller coaster crash course. It's good to be back. It's been a while, hasn't it? For the uninitiated, Coaster Crash Course is my semi-regular series where I use my multiple advanced engineering degrees to talk out of my ass about the physics of roller coasters, answering critically important questions like, is the back row actually better? Why do trim brakes exist? And how come everything suddenly has a swing launch? Today we tackle the most pressing and perplexing existential problem of roller coasters: roughness. But before we dive in and I get super nerdy trying to answer that question, I think it's a good idea to go over some background. What is roughness? What causes it? That sort of thing. First, let's establish what we're working with. Distilled to its essence, a roller coaster is made of two major components: the train, which seats and secures riders for the experience, and the track, which directs the train through the coaster's course. The track can be made out of wooden planks, or steel rails, or some other weird third thing I don't want to entertain. Outside of a small number of very, very old side friction coasters, every modern coaster utilizes 3 sets of wheels. The main guide wheels, which rest on top of the track, the upstop wheels, which sit below the track and prevent the train from flying off during airtime moments, and the side friction wheels, which guide the train through curves. Depending on the design of the trains and the track, the side friction wheels can either be in the inside or on the outside of the rails. Straightforward stuff, right? Good. Let's keep going. Next question then, what is roughness? Well, this is the sort of thing that is easier to experience than it is to explain. You want to know what roughness is? This. Just take a look at this. Roughness is the result of repeated and unwanted side-to-side, up and down, or even front-to-back forces that are unintentionally imparted onto riders as a result of a coaster's condition. A smooth coaster is practically devoid of such forces, and as a result, the forces experienced by riders are the intended forces specifically chosen by the designers of the ride, and nothing else. However, both these intended forces and roughness can coexist. Think of a bouncy bunny hop on a centenarian woodie versus a similar element found on a smoother modern installation or a retracked woodie. Now, both are intended to do the same thing, but the bouncy roughness makes an old woodie airtime hill feel way different. Hills can be rough, valleys can be rough, turns can be rough, even straight sections can be rough. The possibilities are endless. So now that we have defined roughness, we can begin to dissect its root causes. You might be thinking the main contributor to a savage shake lies down here, the point of contact where the train meets the track at the wheel bogies. And, yeah, you would be right, at least for the most part. There are some exceptions, coasters with poor train designs and all that, but these guys are our usual culprits. Now, what is actually happening between the train and the track to cause that dreaded slight rattle? The answer, my friend, is the bane of every mechanical engineer's existence: geometric dimensioning and tolerancing. Buckle up, this is gonna be a rough one. GD&T is a large and somewhat complicated field, but it's probably the most important aspect of effective engineering design, so it is critical to understand. And the general principle of GD&T can be summed up in a short phrase: nothing is truly perfect. Now take a shining pane of glass, the origin of the phrase glass smooth. This has to be pretty damn good, right? Nah. What about a metal pipe, like what we would use to construct steel coaster rails? How hard can it be to make a perfectly straight piece of metal? Really hard, actually. I can continue on. Regrettably, continual imperfection is just the unfortunate reality of the real world. Outside of that one Rick and Morty episode, there is no such thing as true level. So while it might seem completely trivial to produce a perfectly straight piece of track for like a brake run on a roller coaster, reality is a different story. And that said, a brake run still looks straight, doesn't it? Are your eyes deceiving you? Yeah, actually, they are. Imperfections can exist across multiple scales of magnitude. Like, there are cases where a track is so crooked that it's easy to see with the naked eye. But most of the time, deviations are more subtle. Subtle enough that our brains try to correct the slight crookedness, and we perceive the final result as straight. If we really want to confirm this hypothesis, we need to zoom in a bit. And a microscopic evaluation quickly reveals that a supposedly smooth surface is far from uniform. Something as simple as a piece of metal tubing is riddled with ridges and valleys. Don't believe me? Another example then. Ever wondered why a paper cut hurts so goddamn much? Well, this is what a smooth, standard piece of paper looks like under an electron microscope. Pretty damn metal, right? That's a somewhat extreme example here, but paper is a good demonstration that the actual surface quality of an object is defined by more than what can be seen with the naked eye. Even if you think something is smooth, everything in our lives is plagued to some degree by what the scientists like to call roughness. And that is the actual scientific term, by the way. Yay! Back to the steel rails. Let's observe what surface roughness actually looks like. And this little doodad is called a roughness scale, which is pretty self-explanatory. It provides a visualization of different surface roughnesses for a given material. Now take a look at the rightmost side of the scale, which corresponds to the highest roughness. Pits and surface imperfections are easily visible to the naked eye. And honestly, if we look at like a roller coaster rail up close, it's not that far off from this. But as we move towards the left of the scale, these pits and imperfections become increasingly imperceptible. The material gets smoother and smoother, and by the time we get to the smoothest sample with a surface roughness of 20, the sample basically looks like glass. But what did I tell you before? Do not trust those lying eyes. Let's see what the surface looks like under a microscope. The imperfections that are noticeably absent from our eye-level evaluation practically leap from the page. There are a myriad of factors that lead to these microscopic imperfections related to the material properties, manufacturing processes, post-manufacturing treatments, and a million other factors. But that is outside of the scope of this video. You can learn about martensite on your own time. I bring up this information just because I want to hammer in the point that there will always be some level of roughness in our coaster track. We can get things really smooth, but we can never achieve true perfection. What we can do is control just how rough or off our surfaces are. The roughness scale provides an easy illustration. We can build materials to a specific roughness, and if we get our roughness low enough, the result should basically be imperceptibly smooth on ride. So why don't we just make everything super smooth? Don't worry, we'll get back to that in a little bit. I want to first get back on our previous track, both metaphorically and literally. These material imperfections can manifest themselves in a few different ways, which all affect the roughness of a roller coaster. We'll start with the rails themselves. A standard steel coaster utilizes two tubular running rails with a circular cross-section, but as you can probably guess from the previous discussion, a closer examination of our rails will reveal that the ideal circular cross-section we're aiming for is far from flawless. It's not a perfect circle. Sorry, well that's just at one point in space. If we move 5 feet down the track, the rail cross-section might look like this. This is exaggerated for the sake of visualization, of course, but that's how they do it in engineering textbooks, so I don't feel bad. These imperfections in the track pieces, in tandem with the various additional elements of the track assembly, such as cross ties and supports, can compound over a longer length scale and lead to crooked track. known in scientific terms as excessive runout. Imagine it like this. The left running rail is a bit too thick on one side and a bit too thin on the other side. 5 feet down the track, same thing. What happens if the track is consistently slightly too thin on one side and slightly too thick on the other? Well, the track is going to bend towards the thin side. Some coasters have run out dramatic enough to see with the naked eye, one of the most famous examples being the Comet at Hershey Park with its significant lift-hill bend. And you may think that crooked rails would be a basically non-existent problem with stronger steel, but even with the more robust construction of steel coasters, some level of crookedness is impossible to avoid. This inherent crookedness is unfortunately an engineer's worst nightmare. Even on a straight track piece, the rails are never perfectly in alignment with each other. At one point they might be a little closer together than before, and at another point they might be a little bit further away, and at another point they might be bending a bit to the left, and at another point one rail might be higher than the other, etc. Depending on the magnitude of these deviations, that shifting shape can and will be felt in your tush. Imagine now hundreds and thousands of these little imperfections, dotted throughout the entirety of a roller coaster's layout. Go over those little bumps at 50, 60, 70 miles an hour, and in the run out of the rails overall, and you can see where this is going. Ouch. That said, the coaster track itself is certainly not the only culprit. Look at our wheel bogie. It certainly doesn't help that we have a pretty sizable gap between the wheels and the track, right? I'm sure you've all seen that famous photo of El Toro where the train is flying over the ejector camelback. Like, there's a whole lot of room between the main running wheel and the rail. It looks like the damn train's going to fly off. I bet nothing like that will ever happen, thankfully. For a less morbid example, I'm sure you've all heard that satisfying clonk that a B&M Hyper makes when it lands in a valley after a long and floaty airtime hill. This clonk occurs when the main running wheel's basically floating in midair, while the upstop wheels keep the train pinned to the track during an airtime moment, literally crash back down to earth. And that can't be ideal. Which begs the question, why does this gap even exist? There is a good reason, but you're going to have to wait a little bit more to find out. Speaking of finding out, have you ever been curious what happens when you hit the hype button? I'm not really sure either, but I hear that if you hit the hype button enough times, El Toro Ryan will make a personal visit to my house and congratulate me. Which sounds pretty sweet, so hit that hype button and like that video if you haven't already. Dankeschön. Now we know our enemy, and next we need to discuss how to tame it. How do we control the crookedness of the track and mitigate our roughness as much as humanly possible? We've come down to the T in Thomas XL200. Tolerancing. Tolerancing, to put it simply, defines how much or how little a part can deviate from its goal or ideal value. As we have established, it's virtually impossible to make a perfect part that hits all of the values that you want to. But how far can we go from the planned design before we call uncle and throw the whole damn thing out? That's what tolerancing defines. And tolerances are pretty damn important in engineering design. If we don't define any tolerances at all, big variations in the size and shape of parts can occur, which will lead to flopping and crashing all over the place on one end, or the wheel bogie getting stuck on the track like your member in a Chinese finger trap that one time you got a bit too curious on your 15th birthday. Both of those options are pretty bad, so it's crucial to establish boundaries. A lower bound to control the amount of acceptable flop, and an upper bound to ensure the track pieces are never so big that the wheel assembly doesn't fit. With these bounds defined, we can make a sort of box of acceptable values, and that's our tolerance. I'm nerdy enough that I can provide a direct example for you. Here's a print of an engineering drawing from Aerodynamics showcasing the double corkscrew. And if we look at the literal first note, we see the defined track gauge, or the defined distance between the two running rails, with two little numbers right next to it, plus 0.38 minus 0. These little fellas define our tolerance. In fact, that's the actual tolerance that Arrow used in their own coasters. Isn't that cool? Right? The vast majority of dimensions are defined by three separate values: the nominative dimension, the positive tolerance, and the negative tolerance. The bigger number on the left is the nominative dimension, aka the target dimension, the goal, the number we'd want to reach if we could magically produce the perfect part. The absolute minimum is defined by the minimum value, which is the nominative dimension minus the lower tolerance. In this case, it corresponds exactly with the nominative dimension, which happens sometimes. Don't worry about it. The maximum, meanwhile, is the nominative dimension plus the upper tolerance. A one-sided tolerance like this basically means, hey, it's okay if the part slips a bit bigger than the target, but don't let it ever fall below the nominative dimension. Which makes sense, right? These tolerances are defining the track gauge. If the rails are too close together, they will press hard into the side friction wheels, and you're going to get a repeat of that demon incident. The key to taming our rough ride lies somewhere in these mysterious tolerances, so let's get into it. What can we do to improve that rattle? It's natural to first gravitate to the most obvious solution. Just make the track straighter. As I mentioned before, the tolerance window is something we define, and it's something we can control. So why don't we take the tolerance we defined and make it tighter? Especially because we have far more advanced technology now than when Ron Toomer did when he hand-bent all those rails 40 years ago. There is a point here, but unfortunately it's not all sunshine and dandelions. I'm here to break your heart. Yes, in an ideal world we can get those tolerances as tight as we want and produce a track so smooth it would make Morty bust. But this isn't an ideal world, this is a capitalist hellhole, and there is an inverse relationship between tolerance and cost. Even worse, that relationship, it is not a linear one. Prices get way more expensive as tolerances tighten for one simple reason. Tighter tolerances are far more difficult to manufacture. And you eventually reach a point with super tight tolerances where you're tossing out tens or hundreds of fully manufactured parts because they're just the teensiest bit out of spec. Every mechie learns who really calls the shots the hard way when you submit your first part to your boss and learn that your proposed design would cost about 20 times more than the previous part because you wanted the shaft to be super straight. As with most things, it's all about the Benjamins. This does mean, however, that you can solve the problem by throwing money at it. And the most obvious examples of this principle in action are the old-school Vekomas ordered by Disney in the 90s and 2000s. Even the archetypical rough ride maker could fart out some super smooth coasters with the mouse's purse to play with. Well, good luck getting Six Flags to pony up the necessary dough, especially in these tumultuous 2020s. It's a hard truth, but an important one to internalize. New attractions are about money in versus money out. And when you build to a price point, something has to slip. It's not all bad news though. We have, as I alluded to before, come a long way from the Toomer times. Advancements in manufacturing have made it a good bit easier to achieve tolerances that seemed pretty absurd a few decades ago. CAD, along with improvements in metallurgy and engineering design, have made new roller coasters from some manufacturers far smoother than their older counterparts. And we can thankfully isolate the impact of modern track improvements with our built-in control experiment, retracking. Specifically a steel coaster retracking. Obviously retracking makes a huge difference on wood coasters, but wood coasters are a whole different, much more complicated beast than I will take on later. Let's just stick with steel for now, because it only gets retracked once if it's even lucky enough to get a retrack in the first place. The clean break in the timeline this provides gives a strong, built-in distinction between our OG 30-year-old track and brand spanking new replacements. Perfect for a before and after evaluation. Some parks choose to retract the entire coaster in one go, like Alton Towers did when they retracked Nemesis Rebo. You know what, that one's a bad example. But some coasters have received piecemeal, section-by-section retracts, which means that we can observe the differences within the span of a single lap. Anyone who's ridden the big one can attest that there is a comical contrast between the rickety roughness of the older track and the relative smoothness of the shiny new sections. It's easy to feel for yourself. It's like skating over freshly massaged ice before you reach the part of the rink that hasn't been touched by the Zamboni. Manufacturing improvements don't tell the whole story, of course. As coasters age and the track is beat down through millions and millions of cycles, the rails do fatigue and deform, which has a negative impact on the track quality. Well, that's a whole video in and of itself. Luckily, coaster retracts reset the clock and fatigue as well, which is why you glide over that banked hill on the big one with its shiny new track and think, wow, that hill has no airtime whatsoever. It's pretty damn smooth. For a slightly more abstract before-after comparison, how about the Great Nor'easter, which was fully retracked in one go but has like 40 different original installations to compare it to? The new and improved Nor'easter runs so much smoother than any other SLC, despite having the exact same track design, profile, and layout. What the hell kind of voodoo magic did Vekoma invoke to turn this boxing match of a roller coaster into a match for a bat clone? It's just because the track is newer and made to better tolerances. It's not necessarily the fault of the track design either, okay? I'm going to rant about that later. I have the utmost admiration for parks who have the historical reverence and commitment to retrack older steel coasters. The results of a good retrack can salvage aging, previously bumpy rides. And these retracks show us super clearly that the track itself is a significant contributor to a ride's roughness. And that being said, the track tolerancing is only one part of the equation. What about the second piece of the puzzle, that thing that connects the coaster train to the track? Look at that gap. Let's get rid of it. We turn our gaze from our track to the thing that mounts the train to the track, the wheel bogies. Outside of improving track tolerances, the gap in a wheel bogie seems like the most egregious and fixable contributor to a shaky ride. It can't be good to have our bogies bouncing up and down like a ping pong ball as they crash back and forth between the rails uninhibited. If we can close down that tolerance and basically lock the wheels to the track, any play in the wheel assembly should basically disappear. Boom! Genius. But we can't do that. And if you're curious why, well, I've already given you the solution. So put your answers in now. That's right. The rails are crooked. The rails are constantly changing shape and tolerance throughout the layout, even in straight track sections. And I'm not just talking about the weight of the trains wearing the paint down over thousands of cycles. I'm talking about the runout. I'm talking about thick spots or thin spots in the running rails. I'm talking about thermal expansion, which causes the running rails to quite literally grow in size throughout a single day. Oh, that's an annoying one. As the rails heat up from sunlight, increasing temperatures, and constant cycling, the rails do quite literally expand. So say we have a nice, lovely, tight tolerance on our wheel assembly, it is perfectly sized for our 7 a.m. test run. When 2 o'clock comes around, this little piece of perfection might refuse to move. A brief aside here, this might just be anecdotal, but I've definitely noticed that some rides do feel rougher in the morning and get progressively smoother throughout the day. I think it's because those wide tolerances are closing with thermal expansion, at least that's my conjecture. This is all so complicated, isn't it? All this is to say that our track is not static, and so we need a minimum gap. There needs to be a specification to ensure that in the worst case scenario, at the thickest possible point of the track, on the hottest part of the day, the train will still fit. So great, let's get to tolerancing. Thankfully, we really only have 2 tolerances to worry about. The gap between the top wheels and the upstop wheels, and the gap between these side friction wheels and the track gauge. All we have to do is add a tolerance here, and another tolerance here, and we should be able to... Oh, not so fast. This shit's about to get really nasty. Let me introduce you to the tolerance stack. Our wheel assembly is not a single part, but an assembly of a bunch of different parts smushed together. I mean, it's right in the name. Wheel assembly. Running wheels, bearings, mounting brackets, etc. And not only does every individual part have its own tolerance, but when we assemble these individual parts together, the tolerances can end up stacking on top of each other and leading to disaster. Isn't this fun? We'll find out how bad this stack can get by doing an example with a generic roller coaster wheel assembly. On this fella, we have 2 main running wheels, 2 upstop wheels, and 2 side friction wheels for each side of the track. Each of these wheels is mounted through wheel bearings to what we can basically treat as a metal plate with a hole punched in it. Connecting the plates to each other is the wheel bogie. Which is made up of, let's say, like 5 pieces of metal welded together. And finally, there's another hole in another bearing linking up the wheel bogie to the main chassis. What do we have to worry about? Let's see.
The tolerance of the first running wheel, the tolerance of the second running wheel, the tolerance of the upstop wheels, the tolerance of the side friction wheels, the location of the hole for the first running wheel, the location of the hole for the second running wheel, the location of the holes for the other wheels, the location of the hole for the axle, the tolerances in every single one of the wheel bearings, the tolerances in the bearing connecting the full assembly to the train chassis.
Kids, if you're thinking about becoming an engineer, this is what it's actually like. This is the shit that they don't tell you about in school. You're welcome. Now, it's time to find out how it can all go horribly wrong. Say our main wheel is just a little bit bigger than our nominal dimension. It's in spec though, so it should be fine. Now say our upstop wheel is also a little bit bigger than the nominal. Now say the hole for the main guide wheel is drilled just a little bit lower, etc, etc. By themselves, all of these parts are in spec. But if we combined all the parts together, the parts that just happen to stack on each other in the worst possible way, suddenly the wheel assembly doesn't fit over the rail. Oof. Sure, such a scenario is extremely unlikely if every one of your individual parts is in spec, but it is possible, and believe me, there will be a time when your assembly will bite you in the ass because the tolerances all stack up the wrong way. It'll happen to you. So how do we control this Pandora's box of pain before things get out of hand? We need to set up an overall tolerance for the whole assembly after everything comes together. This is known as a tolerance envelope. The number one rule of tolerancing is that the form of a part or assembly is dictated by the limits of size. Basically, what's the smallest it could possibly be and what is the biggest it could possibly be. Here, our envelope is simple. The smallest the gap could possibly be is the maximum size of the running rail at its largest, accounting for factors like a new paint job or thermal expansion. There isn't as strong of a limit on the backside, but obviously a bigger gap will correspond to a rougher ride, and we do want to mitigate that. That said, a little shake is the far more preferable option compared to a train getting stuck, so when in doubt, we always want our gap to be slightly bigger. Like old Ronnie Boy did way back in the day, we're going to create a one-sided tolerance. Our part has to be bigger than this minimum value, which basically means that you're never going to hit the minimum, which is our goal value. Still, we will define an upper limit on our tolerance to somewhat salvage the ride, and let's say we use this general dimension to build our wheel bogie, and our part passes. Great, time to test. We have a simple tool for this called a go-no-go gauge, which is pretty self-explanatory. To say this metal bar is the maximum size of the track. If we stick it through our wheel assembly, will it go through, or will it get stuck and no-go? Let's give this gauge a shot, and we nailed it nice and tight. Now let's put our coaster on the track and see how it goes up the oh no. Our assembly's in spec, why did it get stuck? We accounted for everything. Well, everything except for a critical function of the wheel assembly. The track bends, and we need to account for that bending in the tolerance of our wheel assembly. So now we need to establish a minimum curvature. Alright, I'm going to call it here. This is getting too complicated. It's a lot to take in, I understand. GD&T is an extraordinarily complex field, and I'm just barely scratching the surface here. I haven't even touched on critical principles like datum plane definition or true position tolerancing, which would be massively important in the development of a multi-part wheel assembly. And I also haven't touched on wear and how that significantly impacts the shape of the wheels and thus the tolerance over time. But let's put the textbook away from now. We've done enough. All this mumbo-jumbo is serving the point that tolerancing is a fierce, multi-headed beast. I'd say I'd spend about 20% of my job worrying about tolerancing, or not worrying about tolerancing enough and finding out the hard way after spending thousands of dollars of the lad's money getting prototypes made. And don't ask me how I know. The tolerance stack for a complex assembly such as a wheel bogie makes the achievement of incredibly tight tolerances extremely difficult, at least without draining Scrooge McDuck's pool of every last gold coin. Thus, the gap. I feel at this point I should provide a basic monkey brain summary of wheel assembly tolerancing, so here goes. Wheel bogie made of many parts. Many parts fit together like Lego pieces. Sometimes parts are bigger than planned. Sometimes parts are smaller than planned. When all parts are bigger than planned, wheel bogie too tight to fit on track. That bad. Parts made smaller so bogie don't get stuck. That causes gap. Zimmerman too cheap to make gap smaller. Ignore fact that Zimmerman not there anymore. That said, there is again some good news to report. As manufacturing advancements have improved the design and manufacture of wheel bogie assemblies, tightening tolerances and decreasing wear through better designs and materials. But there is some amount of necessary play that is virtually impossible to completely eliminate, both due to manufacturing limitations and the behavior of the track. Talk about the curvature, Thomas. Talk about the curvature. No. Stay strong, buddy. You can avoid the tangent. I believe in you. So then what else can we do? As I've discussed, wheel assemblies are incredibly complicated and made from at least like 10 individual parts. Of course the stack is terrible. That's so much to put together. We can fix that, right? Let's just make the whole goddamn wheel assembly out of one part. It's much easier to hit tight tolerances if we carve our piece out of a solid block of metal instead of hodgepodging an assembly out of a bunch of different materials. And yeah, this sounds like an engineer's wet dream. I'm basically only entertaining this idea because it would be so cool if it happened, but I don't need to explain that this would be extremely expensive, unfortunately. we're back to the money problem again. The tolerances we could hit if we made the whole axle out of a single piece of milled metal and threw out the assembly once one of the wheels wears out, oh, that'd be great. Now try clearing that with the board members of Cedar Flags. It's not going to go very far. And maybe with advances in additive manufacturing and metal 3D printing, this idea might be a lot less of a pipe dream in the near future. But we're not quite there yet. I'll keep you posted. Alright, I hope your brains haven't been reduced to total mush by now. All this tolerance talk boils down to a simple conclusion. There are solutions to the roughness problem, but those solutions cost money. And if the rumors about B&M cutting costs is to be believed, their modern issues offer pretty damning evidence to support this conclusion. But enough doom and gloom. We have the background now, so it's time to wrap back to the beginning. We have some more questions to answer, starting with the old school elephant in the room. What about wood coasters? Now, wood coasters as a whole are rougher than steel coasters. I'm not going to get any hot water saying that, right? Like, we can all agree on this generalization? Good. And in addition to the more significant additional roughness, the condition of wood coaster track deteriorates much quicker. What gives? We're going to look at the design of wooden coaster track to find our answer. Now, instead of one piece of tubular steel track, a standard wooden coaster track is made of 8 layers of laminated wood, which are smushed together to form the track backbone. That means we have 8 individual pieces adding to the tolerance stack already, and we haven't even added the rails. On the top and sides of the wood track structure, 3 separate pieces of metal are added to track the main riding wheels, the upstop wheels, and the side friction wheels. 3 separate steel pieces into our 8-layer deep wooden base. The tolerance stack becomes even worse. And finally, this doesn't necessarily apply to every woodie, but traditional wood coasters are commonly hand fabricated on site instead of being built off site and assembled as pre-cut pieces like most steel coasters. Obviously, bending tracks by hand is not going to be nearly as precise as prefabricated track manufactured and shaped in state-of-the-art facilities with advanced machinery. And that was the conceit behind the legendary Intamin prefab. Now, eventually the conceit of the prefab fell apart, but that's a different story that I'm not going to get into. From a GD&T perspective, the sheer number of separate parts required to build the rails is obviously a recipe for disaster. And in that convoluted mess of cross ties and supports, Jesus. If something happens to a single one of these pieces, one of the layers splinters, a support begins to sag, etc., you're gonna feel that. Which is why even the smoothest wood coasters don't stay smooth for very long. But we're not done yet. Speaking of the supports, wood structures are much less strong than steel and much more susceptible to minor damage. So while steel coasters can get away with one single tubular support every few feet, woodies require a giant lattice structure made of hundreds of individual planks. Based on this information, it might seem like wooden coasters are doomed from the start. That doesn't sound exactly right. I mean, I've been on some old school woodies that are surprisingly smooth. Almost as smooth, if not smoother than equivalent steel installations. And it doesn't line up with my previous points. And that's because there's actually some advantage to wooden coaster construction. The massive wooden structure, despite its complexity, actually helps with the smoothness. In contrast to steel coasters, wood is much more pliable, so it literally bends and flexes as the train passes by. And this actually improves the ride comfort. A reed that bends in the wind does not break, as they say. The movement of the structure can take some of the forces and dampen out some of the vibrations that would travel back to the train and wreak havoc on some more rigid structures where the forces have nowhere to go. In fact, I would go as far to say that the flexibility of a wood coaster structure is a major contributor to the smoothness of the modern coaster paragon, the RMC Hybrid. Hybrids replace the 8-layered tolerance travesty that is a wood coaster track with smooth, one-piece steel rails, but maintain the forgiving wood structure that can dampen out vibrations as a train passes through. And the result is a glass-smooth ride, even if the swaying can look a bit terrifying from the queue line. One more thing too, just because the tolerance stack is nasty doesn't mean that tight tolerances can't be hit. There are plenty of examples of woodies that offer smooth rides, especially woodies made with modern manufacturing advancements such as gravity group pre-cut track, that can turn the bone-shattering beasts of yesteryear into absolute masterpieces. And finally, one would be foolish to acknowledge that the imprecise tracking and out-of-control sensation it creates is part of the appeal of a wood coaster in the first place. Done well, the bumps and jostles of a good woodie add a lot to the chaos and wildness of the ride experience without ever becoming too unbearable. The natural damping of the wooden structure allows a good woodie to strike the perfect balance of vintage experience and decent ride comfort. Great, what about steel track then? Not all steel tracks are equal, that's for sure. While pretty much every steel coaster utilizes two tubular rails to guide the roller coaster train, the actual track structures vary wildly in overall design and construction, far more than they do with wooden coasters. Perhaps the most complex track design is the dreaded Arrow track, wielded by Vekoma to strike fear in the hearts of enthusiasts the world over. Some people claim that the rough reputation this classic track style garners is due to the location of the side friction wheels on the inside of the track. But I am happy to point you to a litany of examples that demonstrate otherwise. It has more to do with the complexity of the track's construction. Let's look at a close-up of Arrow track. There isn't just one piece of steel connecting the rails with the main tubular track spine like there is with, say, B&M track. In fact, we could see 3 different pieces of rectangular steel tubing welded to 2 connectors that link the supports to the track, and then at least 10 extra metal plates of various shapes to give structural reinforcement. 5 main components, which is less than the 16 needed for a standard woodie, but still a pretty nasty stack. And on top of this stack, we have to also consider that these tracks were built on-site by hand, which makes the possibility for error far more likely. What if the horizontal bottom tube is slightly to the left? What if one of the vertical tubes is not at a perfect 90-degree angle? The track design seems needlessly complicated, especially today, and its complexity can probably be attributed to the manufacturing limitations of the time. Back then, it was better to develop the track out of basic, easily manufactured components than developing a more complex shape. Or maybe Ron Toomer chose this track design because it looks super pretty. Anyway, former Arrow CEO Dana Morgan recognized the shortcomings of this track design when he broke off from Arrow to form D.H. Morgan in the early 90s. He replaced that messy assembly with a single piece of stamped steel. And that retrofit certainly did the job, because Morgan coasters remained renowned for their smoothness 20 years after the damn company went defunct. Arrow caught on too in its final days, as Alan Schilke led the company kicking and screaming into the 90s with the single spine design used in smooth late model Arrows like Tennessee Tornado. Just ignore the fact that the big one uses this track design too. It undermines my point. Okay then, we've established the Arrow track design is flawed. Or is it? Remember the Great Nor'easter? That's an original design. Or Roller Coaster Mayan at Energielandia, a new school SLC that's supposedly smooth from Park that for some reason decided to order a brand new suspended looping coaster in the mid-2010s. With modern manufacturing improvements, even the needlessly complex OG Arrow design can be massaged into smoothness. Or maybe this bizarre track design isn't as bad as you initially think. It is time for me to make a somewhat outlandish sounding claim. You know your local home park Arrow looper? The one that you occasionally thwack your head on and swear off of, even though it's actually a really fun roller coaster and you should give it a second chance, you just have to ride it right? Well, it's not actually rough. Okay, it could be rough, but it's more janky than rough, and the two things are very different. Let me explain what I mean. As we've established, the general culprits in our war against roughness arise from the varying tolerances found in both the track itself and the wheel assemblies. But what do these varying tolerances represent? They represent deviations away from the intended track design, how the track is supposed to be, the way the track flows from element to element. This flow is the track profile, and jank arises not from roughness, but from how the track moves from one element to another. Okay, this can be a bit hard to wrap your head around, so I'm just going to provide some examples to start. That shuffle you experience in the middle of a bad Arrow corkscrew like on Steam and Demon, that's roughness. The wacky transition into the corkscrews where the whole train awkwardly tips on its side, jank. The classic front-to-back, side-to-side shake of an old-school SLC, roughness. That crazy lateral jolt you get when the train sends you through the Sidewinder on the front row, jank. That lap-long, non-consensual grinding session Banshee gives you because you got unlucky with your choice of train, roughness. The violent headbang on Raptor's final turn into the brakes and both corkscrews of its absurdly snappy Cobra roll, jank. The butterfly on Goodery? Okay, that's both. That's definitely both. I hope these examples explain the difference well enough. Jank, aka jerk, which again is the actual scientific term for the rate of change in acceleration, comes about from how the track flows from point to point. As a roller coaster travels through its layout, the train will impart various forces on your body based on how the track moves, which I think is pretty intuitive. If you're going over an airtime hill, you will be lifted out of your seat because the track is guiding the train back down to Earth. If you're at the bottom of a valley, you're going to feel positive G's as the train is forced to fight gravity and travel upwards. Now let's stick with this example. How does the track go from the positives of the valley to the float of the camelback? You obviously can't just instantaneously transition from one into the other. Well, you can, but it'd be really violent, and who would enjoy something like that? You need to transition somehow from the valley into the hill, or you're going to get an extremely rapid change in acceleration or jerk. Now, with the modern coaster, it's easy to slowly taper off the positives and smoothly flow into that airtime hill. Modern transitions can be so gradual that the change in acceleration is basically imperceptible when compared to the acceleration itself. But let's step back in time a little bit. What happens when you don't have the ability to bend steel in the extremely specific and complex shape required to smoothly transition between elements? Well, you have to make do with what you have. A circular valley, then a straight ramp, then a circular airtime hill. That's what you gotta work with. And what happens when you design a ride like this? You go from positives to basically standard gravity in the blink of an eye, and then shift violently from almost no force to airtime once the ramp is over. Behold a triangle hill. I'm going to show some force versus time plots here which illustrate the transition from a valley into an airtime hill for a modern coaster and for an old school steel coaster. The older coaster looks a lot more jagged, doesn't it? Now let's take the derivative of this. Don't worry about what I'm saying if you aren't aware what a derivative is. Just know that the derivative of force gives us jerk, and wow, look at that. Pretty pronounced jerks on the old school arrow. Ah, what a throwback. You may have heard this song and dance before, even from me, but if you haven't, old school coasters, like many arrows, utilize tangent radius design due to manufacturing limitations. So these transitions were inherently jerky just due to their very nature. You couldn't make a smooth transition from one part into the other. And let's look at another example, the arrow loop. The loop is used in engineering textbooks throughout the world as the paragon of a clothoid design, which is partially true, but it's not really telling the whole story. A true clothoid loop constantly decreases in radius with its curve length, keeping the forces consistent. But arrows use a very rudimentary implementation of this principle. Instead of a constantly decreasing radius, which would be hell to manufacture, Ronnie Boy just used two circular sections of different radii. The bottom parts have the wider radius, and then the loop switches to the tighter radius about halfway up. Do you ever notice how your head jerks forward halfway through an arrow loop? That's why. Keep your head back. The point that I'm aiming to make here is that the famous janky arrow transitions very much exist, but they are completely separate from roughness. I don't want to generalize too hard here, there are rough arrows out there, but there are also plenty of smooth arrows that just have janky transitions. Let's look at an example, my favorite example, Zaddy Viper. I've had enough rides on Viper's older brother, the Great American Screen Machine, to say with authority that damn thing was rough. But Viper in comparison is shockingly comfortable. 30 years in the warm California sun and quality maintenance has left the last of the Mega Loopers in commendable condition. In fact, I would almost go as far to say that it's kinda smooth. Just roll the tape. Reverse POV easily demonstrates the difference between roughness and jank. Take the lead into the final corkscrew here. A wonky-ass corkscrew lead sends the rider's head sideways, but the laterals immediately disappear once the train transitions into the glassy smooth corkscrews. Then the transition out of the corkscrews gives another light bop. Oop. It's not roughness, it's jank. Watch the El Toro Ryan Drakenfire video if you want more info. Having said all of this, I'm not trying to pretend that jank is something that can just be ignored. It's not like if you bash your head into the restraint on Alpi's Cobra roll, you can make the pain magically disappear because you know it's totally not roughness, bro. The insane forces imparted by rides during janky moments can literally clock you on the head or clothesline your neck, which is a less than pleasant sensation for anyone involved. But there is a big distinguishing factor that makes jank far more preferable to roughness. Jank is something you can prepare for. If you manage to keep your head back through the worst transitions, you can ride an insanely intense old school coaster like Viper 8 times in a row pain-free, which is what I did if you happen to have any doubts. Or take Anaconda, may it rest in peace, and its once infamous Rose Bowl. There was a pretty nasty transition once that track dropped to lake level, but I just followed it with my head as the train snaked through the awkward moment, and I never had any issues with the rest of the ride. Hell, I find throwing your body weight into aggressive transitions to be quite fun. which is what I do on rides like Maverick and I-305 to prevent myself from being guillotined on the snaps. Jank is something that is almost completely absent in modern coasters, and so the insane jerky forces jank can provide are honestly novel in this day and age in their savagery. It is a major reason why I like old, imprecise arrows. They provide an out-of-control sensation that modern coasters just do not achieve. If somebody remade Magnum today, it would be a lot worse. To conclude this section, Viper at Magic Mountain isn't rough, it's perfection. I miss you, buddy. Come back to me. Alright then, we've finally come to the end of the video, and there are a couple of big takeaways here. Roughness generally comes down to poor tolerances. Some coasters are rougher than others, and a myriad of factors can influence the roughness, including the track tolerance, the age of the track, the condition of the wheel assemblies, yada yada. While the track design can make a rough ride more likely, the design of a track itself is not an inherent death sentence. Jank is different than roughness, and arrow track is not inherently rougher than any other steel track, it's just more likely to be rough due to its more complex design. Wood coasters are similar. They are generally rougher than their steel counterparts because of their layered rail construction, which leads to a pretty hefty tolerance stack, and their hand-built nature makes the track tolerance inherently less precise. Now, finally, there is a solved solution to the roughness problem, and that's called throwing money at it until it goes away. If only we can hit the unlimited money cheat on Roller Coaster Tycoon in real life. One final question remains, though, and it's one that I haven't completely answered yet. What happened with B&M? How did the manufacturer that seemed to have everything down pat descend into rickety disaster? Well, they turned into cheap bastards. I hope you enjoyed this painstakingly thorough deep dive into the nature of roller coaster roughness. I hope I provided enough nourishment to slake your intellectual curiosity, and if I didn't, then you're a sick man. Go hit up an engineer at Vacoma or something. Over here I have a video for you that YouTube thinks you might enjoy, so why not check it out? And subscribe to the channel for more nerdy deep dives like this. Please hype the video and leave a like if you haven't already. It's a huge boon for a smaller channel like me, and it really helps to get my videos seen in the crowded YouTube algorithm. And comment your ideas for future crash courses below. I'm happy to hear them. Thank you for watching.